The voice cut through the fog like a warning no one was supposed to hear. If a dog refuses to leave, it means the truth is still inside. At 5:17 a.m. outside the abandoned Redstone Industrial Complex on the edge of Fort Lewis, Washington, Sergeant Daniel Brooks stood still with his hands resting near his tactical vest, eyes locked on the German shepherd pacing in tight, uneasy circles across the cracked asphalt. The air smelled like cold iron and damp concrete, the kind of smell that clung to forgotten places where time seemed to stop breathing. Daniel was 34, a U.S. Marine with 12 years of service, his posture trained into discipline even when exhaustion lingered behind his eyes. His face carried the quiet wear of long deployments, sun-scorched skin, and nights spent in silence that followed too many missions that never made it into reports. Beside him, Shadow, his K9 partner, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat fading into ash at the shoulders, stood unusually rigid. Shadow was not pacing like he normally did when alerting to a standard perimeter anomaly. This was different. His ears were forward, locked on the massive silhouette of the factory ahead, a structure of rusted steel beams and shattered windows that loomed like a hollow skeleton against the early morning sky. Daniel adjusted his grip on the leash instinctively, though he barely needed it anymore. Shadow had long since stopped behaving like an animal that needed restraint and more like a presence that understood orders before they were spoken. "Easy," Daniel muttered under his breath, voice low and steady, but Shadow didn't respond the way he usually would. Instead, the dog took a single step forward, then another, slow and deliberate, as if something inside that abandoned factory had called his name. Daniel frowned, scanning the perimeter. The report had been simple. Unauthorized motion detected inside the structure overnight, likely wildlife or structural shift due to wind pressure. Nothing that required escalation. Yet standing here now, Daniel felt something else in the air, something harder to name. Not danger exactly, but intention, like the place itself was. Waiting. Shadow stopped abruptly at the edge of a broken chain-link fence that sagged inward like a collapsed rib cage. He lowered his head slightly, sniffing the ground, then lifted his gaze again toward a gap in the factory wall where a door hung half open, swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. That was when Shadow broke formation. He moved forward without hesitation, slipping through the fence opening with a controlled urgency that made Daniel's instincts sharpen immediately. "Shadow, heel," Daniel ordered, firmer now, but the command didn't land the way it always did. The dog didn't stop. Instead, he turned his head just once, looking back at Daniel with an expression that was not defiance, but insistence. It was the same look Daniel had seen once before years ago in a completely different place, on a different battlefield, in a moment no official record ever captured. And that memory tightened something in his chest before he could stop it. The wind shifted slightly, pushing a faint metallic sound through the factory structure, like distant chains moving where no chains should be. Shadow stepped inside. Daniel hesitated for only a second longer than protocol allowed. Then he followed. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world changed in subtle ways. The light outside dulled instantly, swallowed by the factory's interior shadow, where beams of pale gray daylight filtered through broken skylights high above. Dust floated in the air like suspended ash, drifting slowly through shafts of light that cut across abandoned machinery and collapsed scaffolding. Every step Daniel took echoed too loudly, as if the building was listening back. Shadow moved ahead without fear, his body low, focused, nose tracking something invisible but specific. Daniel's hand instinctively hovered near his sidearm out of habit, though nothing visible justified it. Still, his instincts were not calm. They were awake in a way that felt uncomfortable. The factory seemed too intact in places it shouldn't have been, as if certain areas had been preserved deliberately rather than decayed naturally. Shadow stopped again near a corridor entrance marked by a rusted sign that had long lost its letters. He stood perfectly still, ears twitching once, then twice, as though hearing something beneath the structure itself. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What is it, boy?" Shadow didn't move. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly and let out a low, controlled exhale through his nose, the kind of sound that wasn't quite a warning but also wasn't calm. Then he took one slow step forward into the corridor, where the light narrowed into a thin line at the far end. Daniel followed. each step heavier now, not from fear, but from the growing certainty that whatever brought them here was not random. It never was when Shadow acted like this. And somewhere deeper inside the factory, something waited without sound, without movement, but with the kind of presence that made even silence feel like a signal being sent back in return. The deeper they moved into the corridor, the more the world outside seemed to fade behind them, as if the abandoned structure had decided to close itself off from everything familiar and pull them into its own suspended silence. Daniel Brooks slowed his pace instinctively, adjusting to the uneven ground beneath his boots, each step echoing softly through the hollow passageways. Shadow remained ahead, no longer pacing randomly, but moving with a focused certainty that made Daniel's attention narrow. The German shepherd's ears stayed locked forward, not reacting to any visible movement, but to something layered beneath the air itself, something that could not be seen, but clearly could be followed. The corridor widened slightly into what had once been a service passage, lined with faded markings on the walls that had long since lost meaning. Pipes ran overhead, some broken, some intact, dripping faintly into metal grates below, creating a rhythm that was irregular enough to feel intentional rather than natural. Daniel glanced upward briefly, noting how the skylights above were fractured into uneven shapes, allowing thin streams of pale morning light to fall like scattered signals across the interior. Shadow stopped again. This time it was not sudden. It was controlled, deliberate, as if he had reached a point where the signal he was following had become stronger. He lowered his head and inhaled slowly near a junction in the corridor where two paths split in opposite directions. Daniel approached carefully, his voice dropping even lower than before. "What are you picking up?" he asked, though he knew better than to expect a verbal answer. Shadow did not respond in any human sense. Instead, he shifted his weight toward the left corridor, then paused, turning his head slightly, as if confirming something only he could understand. Then he moved again. Daniel followed without hesitation now, not because he understood, but because Shadow's certainty had replaced doubt with something more reliable than logic. The air grew colder as they advanced deeper into the structure, carrying with it a faint metallic undertone that Daniel could not place. It was not the smell of rust alone, nor the dust of abandonment. It was something older, like a memory embedded in steel. The corridor narrowed again, forcing them closer together, and for a brief moment Daniel found himself matching Shadow's pace exactly, step for step, breath for breath. The silence inside the factory was not empty. It was structured, layered, as if sound itself had been organized and then removed, leaving behind the shape of what used to exist. Shadow slowed once more near a partially open door that hung slightly off its hinge. The door swayed gently despite the lack of wind, producing a faint, repetitive creak that echoed into the space beyond. Daniel reached out and steadied it carefully, not pushing it open yet, just holding it in place as if acknowledging that crossing this threshold required intention. Shadow stood still at the entrance, head tilted slightly downward, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. For several seconds neither of them moved. Then Shadow exhaled softly and stepped forward. Daniel followed into the room. The space inside was larger than expected, a former control room or monitoring station, now stripped of anything functional. Rows of broken panels lined the far wall, their screens dark, their surfaces coated in a thin layer of dust that softened their edges. The ceiling above was higher here, allowing a broader shaft of daylight to filter through broken glass overhead, illuminating floating particles that drifted slowly through the air like suspended time. Shadow moved directly to the center of the room and stopped. His posture changed subtly, no longer searching but confirming. Daniel's gaze followed him, scanning the environment carefully. There were no immediate signs of disturbance, no obvious points of interest, yet the atmosphere felt charged, as if the room itself was holding on to something that had not yet been released. Daniel stepped closer to Shadow, lowering himself slightly to observe the dog's focus. That was when he noticed it. A faint marking on the floor beneath layers of dust, partially obscured but deliberate in its shape. It was not random damage or decay. It was structured, geometric, almost intentional in its placement. Shadow lowered his nose toward it, but did not touch it. Instead, he circled it once, then returned to stand beside Daniel, his attention now fixed on the far corner of the room where a set of old storage cabinets stood half open. Daniel approached cautiously, every movement measured. As he neared the cabinets, he noticed something subtle that made him pause. The dust around them was thinner, as if something had disturbed it more recently than the rest of the room. Shadow remained still behind him, no longer leading, but observing. Daniel reached out and slowly opened one of the cabinet doors. Inside, there was nothing immediately unusual, only old equipment cases and faded labels that had long lost clarity. But as he scanned lower shelves, his eyes caught on something that did not belong to the decay around it. A small object, carefully positioned rather than abandoned. He did not touch it yet. Instead, he studied it, his expression tightening slightly as recognition began to form without explanation. Shadow gave a single, quiet breath behind him, steady and controlled, as if confirming that they had arrived exactly where they were meant to be. The room remained silent, but it was no longer empty. Something had been waiting there long before they entered, and now it had finally been found. The moment Daniel Brooks's fingers hovered over the object inside the cabinet, the entire room seemed to tighten around him as if the air itself had become aware of what was about to be discovered. The silence was no longer empty. It was attentive, structured, almost expectant. Shadow remained behind him, perfectly still, his posture aligned with something deeper than alertness, something closer to recognition. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying his breathing as he carefully pulled the object free. It was small, worn, and deliberately placed, not discarded like the rest of the forgotten equipment around it. Dust clung to its edges, but beneath it was something unmistakably preserved. A military identification tag, old enough to have belonged to a previous operation, its surface scratched but still readable under the filtered light spilling from the broken ceiling above. Daniel did not speak immediately. His eyes scanned the engraving, and for a brief moment, the weight of recognition replaced curiosity. Shadow stepped closer then, not rushing, not anxious, but drawn forward by something that felt deeply familiar. He stopped just beside Daniel, lowering his head slightly toward the tag, as if confirming what he already knew. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, not through sound or movement, but through the tension of understanding forming without words. Daniel's mind searched through memory, connecting fragments of training, deployment records, and names he had long buried under routine. The factory was no longer just a structure. It had become a container of echoes. Shadow let out a soft breath and turned his head toward the far side of the room again, this time slower, more deliberate. Daniel followed his gaze. The corner Shadow was watching contained a wall section that looked no different from the rest at first glance, but the dog's focus suggested otherwise. Daniel approached carefully, scanning the surface. The paint was faded, peeling in irregular patterns, yet there was a subtle alignment in the way the markings had degraded, as if something had once been mounted there for a long time. He reached out and pressed lightly against the wall. It responded with a faint hollow sound. Beneath his knuckles, Shadow moved forward and placed himself directly beside Daniel, now no longer scanning, but waiting. Daniel stepped back half a foot, reassessing the structure. The wall was not solid. It had been modified or sealed at some point in the past. His hand moved along the surface until he found a faint seam that ran vertically, nearly invisible unless seen at an angle. Without rushing, he traced it slowly, confirming what instinct was already suggesting. Behind this section was space. Something had been hidden here deliberately. The realization did not bring urgency or fear. Instead, it brought a stillness that was heavier than both. Shadow sat down quietly, his eyes fixed on the same point Daniel was studying, as if he had completed his task and was now waiting for Daniel to complete his. The room around them seemed to dim slightly as clouds outside shifted, reducing the already thin light filtering through the broken ceiling. Daniel stepped closer again, this time placing both hands against the seam. He did not force it open. He simply acknowledged it, studying it as though it had been waiting for him longer than the time he had been inside the factory. Shadow remained motionless beside him, his presence steady and grounded, reinforcing the sense that nothing here was accidental. The discovery inside the cabinet, the identification tag, the marked wall, all of it formed a pattern that Daniel could not yet fully interpret, but instinctively understood was connected. He took a slow step back, scanning the room once more, allowing the weight of what they had found to settle into perspective. The factory was not abandoned in the way most places were abandoned. It had been left behind with intention, and more importantly, it had been waiting to be found by something that still remembered how to look. Shadow lifted his head slightly, eyes steady, waiting for Daniel's next move, as the silence between them deepened into something that felt less like absence and more like a message finally being received. Daniel Brooks stood still with both hands lowered now, watching the seam in the wall as if it might respond to patience rather than force. The silence inside the abandoned structure had changed again, becoming denser, more deliberate, like the building itself was holding its breath. Shadow remained seated at his side, but his attention had not shifted even once. His amber eyes were fixed on the same vertical line Daniel had traced moments earlier, as though confirming that everything they had followed had led precisely here. Daniel exhaled slowly and stepped one pace back, allowing himself to reassess instead of reacting. The identification tag still rested in his hand, its worn surface heavier now with meaning he could not fully place. It was not just an object. It was a signal, one that did not belong to the present moment but still refused to be forgotten. He turned it slightly under the dim light filtering through the fractured ceiling, noticing for the first time a faint secondary engraving along the edge, partially eroded but not entirely gone. It was not part of standard issue formatting. It looked personal, almost intentional, as if someone had added it after official issuance. Shadow shifted his weight subtly, rising from his seated position and taking a slow step toward the wall again. He did not bark or scratch this time. Instead, he pressed his nose lightly near the seam and exhaled, a controlled, steady breath that seemed to anchor the moment more than disturb it. Daniel followed his movement carefully, placing his palm flat against the wall again, this time slightly higher. The surface felt colder than expected, almost unnaturally uniform in temperature compared to the rest of the room. He traced upward until his fingers found a subtle irregularity, a depression barely visible unless touched directly. His instinct tightened. This was not structural decay. It was intentional concealment. He glanced once toward Shadow, who remained perfectly aligned with the same point of focus, as if waiting for permission that did not need to be spoken. Daniel took a slow step sideways, aligning himself with the seam. The room behind them remained unchanged, yet the perception of it felt different now, like the space had shifted from passive environment to active memory. He studied the wall for several seconds before finally applying gentle pressure along the lower section of the seam. At first, nothing moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, a faint mechanical resistance released somewhere inside the structure, followed by a soft internal click that echoed through the hollow space beyond. Daniel paused immediately, holding his breath without realizing it. Shadow did not move. The sound had not startled him. If anything, it confirmed what he already understood. Daniel pressed again slightly, and this time a narrow section of the wall shifted inward by a fraction of an inch. Dust trickled down from the edges in slow motion, disturbed after years of stillness. The opening was not yet visible, but its presence was undeniable now. A concealed threshold had been waiting behind layers of silence and time. Daniel stepped back half a pace, evaluating the stability of the structure, then looked once more at Shadow. The dog had now stood fully, but still made no sudden movement. His posture was not alert in the traditional sense. It was composed, focused, almost reverent in its stillness. Daniel felt a shift inside himself he could not easily name. This was no longer a routine inspection or a response to an anomaly report. This was something deeper, something that felt less like discovery and more like return. He placed both hands on the wall again and applied steady pressure along the seam. The concealed panel gave way slowly, releasing inward with a muted mechanical sigh that suggested long-forgotten engineering rather than recent construction. A narrow gap formed, revealing darkness beyond that was not complete absence, but contained space waiting to be revealed. Air from within drifted outward, cooler and slightly stale, carrying the faintest trace of something that did not belong to decay or abandonment alone. Daniel did not step inside yet. He simply observed the opening, allowing his eyes to adjust to the difference in depth. Shadow moved closer and stopped just behind him, not crossing the threshold, but clearly acknowledging it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was structured, like a pause between signals, waiting for the next one to be understood. "Daniel," lowered his gaze briefly to the identification tag still in his hand, then back to the opening in the wall. Nothing about this felt random anymore. Every step Shadow had taken, every pause, every deviation from standard behavior had led here without hesitation. And now, standing at the edge of what had been hidden for an unknown amount of time, Daniel realized the factory was not simply a place of abandonment. It was a place of preservation, and whatever lay beyond this concealed wall had been waiting for someone who would not ignore the signal when it finally answered back. The concealed opening widened slowly as Daniel Brooks maintained steady pressure, the mechanism inside the wall releasing with a controlled resistance that sounded more like memory unlocking than metal moving. A narrow passage appeared beyond the panel, revealing a space that had not seen light in a very long time. Dust drifted outward in soft waves, illuminated by the faint daylight filtering from the fractured ceiling behind them. Daniel did not enter immediately. He adjusted his breathing, letting his eyes adapt to the deeper darkness inside the passage. Shadow stood just behind him, completely still, his posture no longer exploratory but deeply attentive, as if he recognized something that existed beyond physical space. The air coming from the opening carried a distinct shift in temperature, cooler and more stable than the room they had just left, suggesting this space had been sealed with intention rather than abandonment. Daniel reached forward and activated a small tactical flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness in a tight, controlled line. The interior revealed itself gradually, not as a large room, but as a narrow archival chamber lined with metal shelving units. Each shelf held organized containers, faded labels, and sealed storage boxes arranged with precision that contrasted sharply with the decay of the factory outside. This was not random storage. It was preserved. Daniel stepped inside carefully, his boots making almost no sound on the concrete floor. Shadow followed but stopped just at the threshold, choosing to remain partially in the corridor as if respecting a boundary that had meaning beyond physical structure. Daniel swept the light slowly across the shelves, noting patterns instead of chaos. Many of the labels were military-coded, some partially redacted, others marked with dates that suggested long-term classification rather than temporary storage. He moved closer to one of the lower shelves and crouched slightly, scanning the contents of a sealed container. Inside were organized folders, each one carefully preserved in protective casing. The edges of the documents were aged but not destroyed, indicating deliberate maintenance over time. Daniel hesitated before touching anything, as if the act of contact would finalize the reality of what he was seeing. Shadow shifted slightly at the doorway, letting out a soft, controlled breath that seemed to anchor Daniel's attention back to the present moment. Daniel opened the container carefully. Inside, the first folder bore a familiar designation style, but it was not the code itself that tightened his focus. It was the handwritten annotation on the top corner, faint but unmistakably human. It referenced field operations connected to K-9 units deployed under specialized conditions. Daniel's grip tightened slightly around the folder as he scanned further. Names were partially visible, some crossed out, others preserved. Among them were references that aligned with units he had encountered in previous deployments, though the context here was different, more observational than operational. He closed the folder slowly and placed it back exactly as he found it, as if preserving the integrity of the system mattered more than his immediate understanding. Shadow had now stepped fully into the chamber, moving with quiet precision to Daniel's side. He did not look at the shelves. Instead, he focused on a single direction deeper within the archive room, where another partition section stood separated by a narrow metal frame. Daniel followed Shadow's gaze and moved forward again, flashlight angled slightly downward. The second section of the chamber was smaller, almost like a dedicated alcove. Inside it sat a single reinforced case placed on a raised platform, unlike anything else in the room. Its surface was cleaner than the surrounding environment, suggesting it had been accessed or maintained more recently than the rest of the archive. Daniel approached it slowly, feeling an unexplainable weight build in the space between each step. Shadow remained still, watching without movement, as if confirming that this moment required Daniel alone to proceed. Daniel knelt beside the case and examined its locking mechanism. It was not forced or damaged. It was intact, as if waiting for the correct authorization that no longer existed in any official system. He hesitated for a brief moment, then placed his hand gently on the surface. The metal felt colder than the surrounding air, almost intentionally preserved in its condition. He did not open it yet. Instead, he studied it, noticing subtle markings etched along the side, faint but deliberate, suggesting a personal identifier rather than institutional labeling. Shadow gave a quiet exhale behind him, steady and calm, reinforcing the sense that they had reached the center of what the factory had been concealing. Daniel lowered his hand slightly, resting it beside the case instead of opening it, allowing the silence of the chamber to settle fully around them. In that moment, the weight of everything they had followed converged into a single point of stillness. The signals, the movements, the hidden structures, all of it had led here without deviation. And as Daniel remained kneeling in front of the sealed case, he understood that whatever was inside was not just stored information, but something preserved for a reason that had been waiting to be remembered. Daniel Brooks remained kneeling beside the sealed case for several seconds without moving, as if waiting for the object itself to acknowledge his presence. The chamber around him felt even quieter now, the kind of silence that was no longer empty but intentionally maintained, like a space preserved for a purpose that had not yet been completed. Shadow stood just behind him, perfectly still, his posture aligned with the direction of the case, eyes locked on it with a focus that did not waver. Daniel slowly exhaled and shifted his hand to the locking mechanism. It was simple in design but reinforced, built to resist casual access. He studied it carefully, not with urgency, but with the measured patience of someone who understood that certain things were not meant to be opened quickly. The flashlight beam illuminated the edges of the case, revealing faint wear patterns along the seams, suggesting it had been handled in the past, but always returned to the same position. Daniel adjusted his grip and applied gentle pressure. The mechanism responded with a soft internal click, followed by a slow release of tension that echoed faintly through the chamber. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then the lid shifted upward by a fraction of an inch, as if exhaling after years of restraint. Daniel paused again, maintaining control over his movements. Shadow did not react outwardly, but his ears tilted slightly forward, indicating full awareness of the change. Daniel lifted the lid fully. Inside, the case was lined with protective material, carefully arranged to preserve its contents. The first object he saw was a folded tactical field document, placed at the top with deliberate precision. Beneath it were additional items, all arranged in a way that suggested importance rather than storage. Daniel reached in slowly and picked up the top document. As he unfolded it, the flashlight revealed a structured layout of operational notes, handwritten annotations, and coded references to field events. His eyes moved across the page steadily, absorbing information that immediately altered his understanding of what this place represented. This was not simply an archive. It was a record of observation and response, maintained with precision far beyond standard procedure. Shadow shifted slightly behind him, then stepped closer, stopping just at Daniel's shoulder. His gaze remained fixed on the open case, not on the documents, as if his attention was divided between what was visible and what was remembered. Daniel turned another page carefully. Beneath the field document was a second item, thinner and more personal in appearance. It was a compact record card, partially laminated, bearing identification details that had been preserved. Despite time, the edges were worn, but the information remained legible. Daniel hesitated before reading it fully. When he did, his expression changed subtly, not in shock, but in recognition that carried emotional weight without immediate explanation. He lowered the card slightly, allowing the flashlight to illuminate the rest of the case. Beneath the documents lay a small set of items arranged with care. A worn fabric tag, a fragment of tactical gear, and a compact identification marker that appeared to belong to field equipment assigned long ago. Each item was positioned deliberately, as if preserving context rather than simply storing artifacts. Daniel placed the document back gently and leaned slightly closer to the case. Shadow moved at that moment, stepping forward until he was directly beside the open container. His body lowered slightly, not in submission, but in recognition. He stared into the contents without moving, holding still in a way that felt deeply intentional. Daniel noticed this shift and paused, observing Shadow carefully. The dog's breathing remained steady, but his posture suggested something internal had activated, a memory or recognition that existed beyond verbal explanation. Daniel glanced back at the identification card and then toward Shadow again. The connection between them, between the room, and between everything they had followed into this hidden chamber was no longer abstract. It was converging into something structured and undeniable. He closed the document slowly and returned it to its position inside the case, maintaining the same precision with which it had been arranged. Shadow remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on the contents, as if confirming that nothing here was accidental. Daniel lowered his hand beside the case and allowed himself a brief moment of stillness. The chamber no longer felt like a storage space. It felt like a record that had been waiting for acknowledgement. And as he stood there with Shadow beside him, both focused on the preserved contents of the sealed case, the weight of what they had uncovered settled fully into the silence around them, marking a point from which nothing would remain. Unchanged, Daniel Brooks stood motionless beside the open case, the faint hum of the abandoned structure settling back into the chamber like a slow returning breath. The documents he had just reviewed were still fresh in his mind, but their meaning was no longer isolated. They were part of a pattern now, one that extended beyond paper, beyond storage, beyond anything that could be explained by standard operational procedure. Shadow remained close to him, no longer scanning the room or reacting to movement, but fixed in a steady state of awareness that felt deeper than alertness. His posture had softened slightly, but his attention had not. Daniel slowly lowered the identification card back into the case and closed the lid halfway, not fully sealing it, as if acknowledging that what they had uncovered was not meant to be hidden again. He turned his attention to the chamber around them, letting the flashlight beam drift across the surrounding shelves. Everything here was arranged with intent, not abandonment. The realization carried a quiet weight that pressed into the stillness. Shadow shifted his position and moved away from the case for the first time, walking slowly toward the center of the chamber. Daniel followed his movement with his light, watching as the German Shepherd stopped beneath a narrow section of exposed piping overhead. The dog lifted his head slightly, ears angled forward, and remained fixed in place. Daniel approached carefully, his steps controlled and measured. When he reached Shadow's position, he noticed something subtle in the structure above. A small metallic fixture embedded into the pipe system, nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding material, but positioned with deliberate precision. He raised the flashlight closer, revealing faint markings etched into the metal, similar in style to the identifiers they had already seen inside the case. Shadow did not move, but his focus intensified. Daniel studied the fixture for several seconds before realizing it was not decorative or structural. It was part of a system, something designed to connect or transmit, not simply exist. He traced the pipeline visually, following it across the ceiling until it disappeared into the far wall. The chamber was no longer just a storage space. It was integrated into a larger network within the factory itself. Shadow took a single step forward and then stopped again, now positioned directly beneath the pipe connection. Daniel lowered his light and scanned the surrounding area more carefully. The realization came gradually rather than suddenly. This room was not isolated. It was a node, a controlled point within a hidden structure that extended beyond what they had initially seen. He turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight back toward the entrance they had used. The concealed wall still stood partially open behind them, but now it no longer felt like the only threshold. Shadow moved closer to Daniel's side again, pressing slightly against his leg in a quiet, steady presence. It was not urgency he was expressing, but certainty. Daniel looked down at him briefly, then back toward the chamber. The identification tag, the documents, the sealed case, and now the structural system above them were all pieces of something larger, something intentionally preserved and carefully layered over time. He stepped closer to the wall-mounted piping and followed its path again with his eyes. At a junction point near the ceiling, he noticed a faint indicator light embedded in the metal, barely visible and still faintly powered despite the apparent abandonment of the facility. That detail changed everything about the room's perceived age. Daniel took a slow breath, absorbing the implication. This space was not simply forgotten. It was maintained in parts, activated in parts, and concealed in layers that required deliberate access to understand. Shadow remained still, watching Daniel now instead of the environment, as if awaiting interpretation rather than action. Daniel lowered his flashlight slightly, allowing the dim ambient light from above to take over. The chamber felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because its purpose had become clearer. It was not a storage room. It was a point of convergence. And as Daniel stood there with Shadow beside him, both surrounded by systems designed to remain unseen, the understanding settled quietly between them that the factory was not hiding the past by accident, but preserving it with intention that was still active in the present moment. The faint indicator light Daniel Brooks had noticed earlier became more difficult to ignore as he and Shadow stood beneath the exposed pipe system, both of them still in a silence that felt heavier than before. The chamber no longer felt like an isolated archive. It felt connected, as if every element inside it was part of a larger structure that extended far beyond what the eye could immediately see. Daniel slowly lifted his flashlight again, tracing the pipes upward with controlled movement, following the line of metal until it disappeared into a junction near the far wall. The small light he had seen earlier was still present, faint but consistent, suggesting that power was being maintained at a minimal level. That detail changed the nature of everything he had assumed about the building. Shadow remained still, but his focus had shifted upward as well, mirroring Daniel's attention with a precision that felt almost synchronized. Daniel lowered his gaze and took a slow step toward the wall where the pipe system converged. As he approached, he noticed something else that had been partially obscured earlier. A subtle outline in the wall paneling, almost invisible unless viewed from an angle, suggesting another concealed mechanism similar to the entrance they had used before. He reached out carefully and ran his fingers along the surface. The material felt consistent at first, but then slightly uneven near the center seam, confirming that this section, like the others, was designed to open rather than remain fixed. Shadow moved closer, positioning himself directly beside Daniel, his posture calm but fully attentive. There was no urgency in his movement, only certainty, as if he understood that they were now moving deeper into a system rather than a single room. Daniel adjusted his stance and pressed lightly against the seam. For a moment, nothing responded. Then, with a faint mechanical release, a section of the wall shifted inward by a small margin, revealing a narrow continuation of the structure beyond. Unlike the previous chamber, this passage was not filled with shelving or storage. It was a controlled corridor lined with uniform panels and embedded structural conduits that ran along both sides. The design was deliberate, minimal, and far more modern than the surrounding factory environment. Daniel paused at the threshold, letting the flashlight beam extend into the corridor. The light revealed a straight path forward, uninterrupted, with faint reflective markers placed at measured intervals along the walls. This was not abandoned space. It was maintained infrastructure. Shadow stepped forward first, crossing into the corridor without hesitation. Daniel followed closely behind, his steps slower as he absorbed the implications of what they were now seeing. The air inside the corridor was different, more regulated, with a faint mechanical consistency that suggested active environmental control. Daniel's mind processed the shift quickly. This section of the facility was not part of the original factory layout. It had been integrated later, or hidden within it with purpose that extended beyond simple concealment. Shadow continued forward at a steady pace, stopping briefly at each faint marker along the wall, as if tracking something invisible but structured. Daniel observed this behavior carefully, noting that the dog was no longer reacting to stimuli, but following a pattern. They reached a slight bend in the corridor where the structure opened into a wider junction space. Here, the ceiling was higher and additional pipe systems intersected overhead, forming a network that extended in multiple directions. At the center of the junction stood a single vertical console embedded into the wall, inactive at first glance, but still faintly powered, indicated by a dim pulse of light near its base. Daniel approached the console slowly, scanning its surface. It contained no obvious interface, only a minimal panel and a recessed identification slot similar to those seen earlier. Shadow stopped a few feet away, watching Daniel without moving closer. Daniel studied the console for several seconds, then lowered his flashlight and stepped slightly to the side to examine the surrounding structure. The corridor behind them remained open, but ahead, the system branched further, suggesting multiple layers of controlled access points. The realization settled gradually but firmly. This was not a hidden room. It was a controlled network embedded within the factory itself, designed for restricted movement and selective access. Daniel placed his hand near the console, but did not activate it. Instead, he paused, allowing the weight of the environment to fully register. Shadow remained still, eyes fixed forward, as if waiting for the next decision to be made. In that moment, the silence was no longer just absence of sound. It was structure, intention, and direction combined into a system that had been waiting for them to reach this exact point. Daniel Brooks stood in front of the embedded console at the junction point of the corridor, his hand hovering just inches away from the recessed panel, as if the air itself had become part of the decision. The faint pulse of light near the base of the system continued at a steady rhythm, neither accelerating nor fading, suggesting a controlled state rather than a dormant one. Shadow remained a few feet behind him, perfectly still, his attention locked forward in a way that suggested full awareness of the significance of the moment without any visible agitation. Daniel slowly exhaled and shifted his stance, bringing the flashlight closer to the surface of the console. The structure was minimal, designed without excess, with only a single interface slot and faint etched markings along the edges that matched the same design language they had already encountered deeper inside the facility. This was not improvised. It was engineered as part of a unified system. He studied the slot carefully, noting that it was shaped for a specific type of identification input rather than general access. His fingers tightened slightly around the identification tag he had recovered earlier, the weight of it now carrying more relevance than before. He did not insert it immediately. Instead, he stepped back half a foot and scanned the corridor again. The network extended in both directions, with faint reflective markers continuing along the walls at measured intervals, suggesting that this junction was only one node among many. Shadow took a slow step forward, then stopped directly beside Daniel, aligning himself with the console without touching it. The dog's posture remained steady, but his focus was absolute, directed at the interface as if it represented a point of recognition rather than uncertainty. Daniel looked down at him briefly, then back at the console. The silence between them felt structured now, as if the environment itself was awaiting activation. He raised the identification tag slowly and held it near the slot, observing the faint change in the console's indicator light. It did not fully activate, but it responded, shifting slightly in intensity as if acknowledging proximity. That small reaction confirmed what Daniel had already begun to understand. This system was not passive. It was responsive. He paused again, weighing the implications, then gently aligned the tag with the slot. As he did, Shadow stepped forward by a fraction, not interfering, but drawing closer as if preparing for whatever would follow. Daniel hesitated for only a moment longer before inserting the tag into the console. The moment it made contact, the faint pulse of light stabilized, becoming more defined, and a subtle vibration moved through the structure beneath their feet. The corridor around them remained visually unchanged, but the atmosphere shifted in a way that was immediately perceptible, as if the system had acknowledged authorization and transitioned into an active state. Daniel kept his hand on the tag, not removing it yet, watching the console carefully. Shadow remained still, his eyes fixed forward, ears slightly angled as he registered the change in the environment. A soft mechanical tone emerged from within the wall, not loud, but precise, followed by a faint sequence of indicators lighting up along the corridor beyond them. The network was awakening in segments, not all at once, but in controlled progression. Daniel slowly removed his hand from the tag, but did not withdraw it from the console. He observed the corridor ahead as additional faint lights activated in sequence, extending deeper into the structure, revealing that the system continued far beyond what they had initially traversed. Shadow turned his head slightly in the direction of the newly illuminated path, then back to Daniel, as if confirming that the decision had already been made. Daniel stepped back from the console, allowing the identification tag to remain in place, and turned his attention fully toward the corridor ahead. The environment had changed, not in appearance alone, but in function. What had once been a hidden structure was now responding to their presence, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment of activation. Shadow moved forward first, taking the lead without hesitation. Daniel followed closely behind, the flashlight now secondary to the faint, systematic illumination guiding the path ahead. As they advanced deeper into the corridor network, the structure around them felt increasingly less like an abandoned factory and more like a preserved system that had just begun to reveal its intended purpose.